You follow rules you never agreed to. You chase goals you didn't choose and call it free will. You wake up with pressure on your chest and think it's discipline. You overthink your words before speaking and think it's politeness. You shrink your voice in front of power and call it respect. But what if none of that was yours? What if those weren't values, but programs you were trained to obey without ever being told you were obeying? Subtle rules, silent codes, invisible punishments for being too bold, too slow, too different. They never had to chain your body, they just coded your mind. And now, you carry their laws like gospel, without question, without revision, without even knowing they exist. But here's the quiet truth. You didn't create these laws. You just inherited them. And unless you rewrite them, you'll keep enforcing them against yourself. Because mental slavery doesn't need guards. It only needs obedience. And the scariest obedience is the kind you mistake for identity. So this isn't about rebellion. This isn't about motivation. This is about jurisdiction. Who gets to define what your mind follows? Because someone already has. And unless you reclaim authorship, your story isn't yours, not yet. But where did those laws come from? And how did they take root? They didn't need to force your mind. They only needed to install defaults. A default way to measure your worth. A default way to process shame. A default idea of success, failure, love, and power. You didn't agree to these laws, you just absorbed them. You must earn love. If you're not struggling, you're lazy. Never make people uncomfortable, even if you're drowning. No one sat you down and said them outright. They were taught in glances, in silence, in praise withheld, in punishments disguised as lessons. So you adapted. Not because it felt right, but because it felt necessary. And slowly, what once felt like a performance became your identity. You began to self-correct before anyone corrected you. You shamed yourself before they had to. That's the power of unspoken law. It rewrites your reactions before you even notice the trigger. Most people think they have beliefs, but what they actually have is compliance memorized so deeply. They confuse it for morality. They live within mental architecture they didn't design, but feel guilty for questioning. That's how control works. It doesn't restrict your body. It restricts what you believe you're allowed to want. And here's the trap. The more you succeed inside the blueprint, the harder it becomes to leave it. Because now you're not just escaping a system. You're risking the meaning you built inside it. So you keep the law alive. Not because it empowers you, but because it explains your suffering. It gives it structure. It gives it a name. And without it, you're forced to redefine everything. And that's terrifying, because to question the blueprint is to admit that what you've built was never yours. But here's the truth. If you didn't write the rule, you don't owe it your life. And if the blueprint was designed to contain you, you're not breaking it by rewriting it. You're correcting the lie. So how do you do that? How do you break internal law without destroying yourself in the process? Rebellion doesn't always look like resistance. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it sounds like a question no one dares ask. Who wrote this rule, and why do I still obey it? That's the beginning of cognitive rebellion. Not loud, not impulsive, but surgical. A slow dissection of every law your mind calls truth. And here's the first principle. If it governs your identity, it must be examined. Ask yourself, do I believe this because it aligns with my values, or because it's what got me approval? Most of what you follow isn't logic. It's conditioning wrapped in memory. You didn't choose it, you just adapted to survive. And that adaptation became law, unwritten, unspoken, unquestioned. But every law has a source, and every source can be challenged. Here's how it begins. Step 1, name the law, say it out loud, write it down. If you can't name what controls you, it already wins. Step 2, challenge the authority. Who said this rule was truth? Did it come from strength or from someone else's fear? Step 3, break the loop. Interrupt the behavior that reinforces the law. If the law says, be quiet to stay safe, speak when it feels uncomfortable. Step 4, install the rewrite. Don't just delete, replace. If the old law was, I need to prove I matter, your rewrite is, my existence is already proof. You don't need a revolution, you need internal reprogramming. Because the real power isn't just in breaking a rule, it's in replacing it with a law you consciously authored. Most people stop at awareness. They realize something's wrong, but they never redesign the system inside. So they circle back, fall into silence again, make peace with the pain, because it's familiar. But pain isn't proof of purpose, and guilt isn't a compass. Just because a thought feels familiar doesn't mean it's yours. Just because a law is old doesn't mean it's right. You don't need permission to rewrite your mind, you just need jurisdiction. And the only way to claim it is to decide that you no longer owe anyone a mental tax for the person you used to be, because the old law was written in survival. But survival is not the standard anymore. Sovereignty is. And sovereignty begins when you realize your mind is not public property, it's private land. And now, you decide who gets access. But awareness is just the entry point. To hold sovereignty, you need structure. And that's where we go next. Once you become aware of the laws you've inherited, the next question is simple but powerful. What governs you now? Because clarity without structure is just chaos in disguise. To reclaim your mind, you don't just delete what's false. You build what's enforceable. That's where inner jurisdiction begins. A sovereign mind isn't just free. It's fortified. Not everything gets in. Not every opinion is valid. Not every emotion is honored. And this isn't arrogance. It's filtration. You must build a court inside your mind, that every thought must stand before and be judged. This is strategic deprogramming. It doesn't mean isolation. It means authority. Because without authority, you'll obey the loudest voice, not the truest one. So how do you begin? Step 1. Establish a mental code. This is not a list of affirmations. This is law, unbreakable, non-negotiable. For example, I do not act from guilt. Silence is a strategy, not submission. I don't explain my value, I embody it. Step 2. Audit your reactions. Every triggered emotion reveals a law you're still obeying. Ask, what law just got activated in me? Who put that there? Step 3. Revoke old authorities. That voice in your head that says, you're falling behind. Whose voice is it? Your parents? Your culture? Your past self? Whoever it is, they don't rule here anymore. Step 4. Enforce without announcement. Your new law doesn't need to be posted. It just needs to be practiced. In silence, in precision, without exception. This is how you build a new architecture inside your own mind, not with motivation, with enforcement, because enforcement doesn't require feeling ready. It just requires clarity. And clarity is what separates noise from law. Let the world be loud. Let their rules contradict themselves. Let their narratives shift with every headline. You don't move with the world. You move from your center, and the stronger that center becomes, the more immune you are to manipulation. Because when someone tries to project their frame on you, it bounces. Not because you resisted, but because your jurisdiction didn't allow entry. This is what most people miss. Sovereignty is not about building walls. It's about building filters, to know what belongs and what must be rejected, without hesitation. Because every time you hesitate, you let something foreign pass through the gate. And enough of those becomes a takeover, but not for you, not anymore, because now there's a law in place. And every thought, every influence must answer to it. So what happens when the world tries to override that law? What happens when silence becomes your final defense? We go there next. Once the inner law is written, you no longer need to announce it. You enforce it in silence. Because real power doesn't explain itself. It doesn't ask to be heard. It doesn't beg to be respected. It simply exists and shifts everything around it. This is shadow sovereignty, the kind of dominance that doesn't move loudly. It just becomes the gravity in the room. You've seen it before, the person who says little dash, but everyone watches, the one who doesn't argue, but ends the conversation with a glance, the one who doesn't justify because they don't play by the same rules. They don't seek control. They are control, and their silence isn't absence, it's architecture. Because when you stop explaining yourself, people are forced to interpret, and interpretation creates tension. Tension creates influence, and influence without effort creates obedience. This is how laws spread, not through loudness, but through presence that reshapes the frame. Most people fear being misunderstood, but the sovereign welcomes it, because misunderstanding forces others to reveal their assumptions, and every assumption exposed is a weapon returned to sender. So what does this look like in practice? You don't defend your new standards, you apply them unapologetically. You don't argue about what changed. You move like the change is law. You don't explain your silence. You let it pressure the noise into submission. Because when people can't predict you, they recalculate around you, and soon, your silence becomes a frame of its own. A frame that distorts their certainty. A frame that forces recalibration. A frame that makes them second-guess what they assumed about you and about themselves. This is not manipulation. This is asymmetric power. You no longer fight for space. You become the space others adjust to. And from that space dash, you shape perception without touching it. Because here's the paradox of power. The less you respond, the more control you gain. Why? Because control isn't about what you say. It's about what you don't need to say. Silence, when anchored in sovereignty, becomes law. Not because you demand it, but because you no longer question it. And when that level of clarity exists inside you, even chaos can't pierce it. Let them misread you, let them underestimate you, let them fill in the blanks with noise, because every time they do, they reinforce the reality you never had to explain. And that is the highest law. But what happens when you stop playing their game entirely? when your reality becomes the dominant frequency. Let's finish this war properly. At some point, silence turns to signal, signal turns to frame, and frame becomes law, not just inside you, but around you. Because when you hold a law long enough, you don't just enforce it, you reshape the terrain others walk on. This is the final shift. You're no longer adjusting to the world begins adjusting to you, not because you forced it, but because you refuse to move. People begin to second-guess their tone when they speak to you. They prepare their words. They tread lightly, not out of fear, but out of subconscious alignment. Because your field demands recalibration. They don't know why they feel pressure, why they can't lie around you, why their games fall flat. But it's not magic. It's enforcement. Consistent, unwavering, unexplained. And it shifts them. This is what sovereign structure does. It becomes the invisible architecture. Other people have to navigate. When you stop reacting, they recalibrate. When you stop explaining, they start self-correcting. When you stop softening, they raise their standard or fall away. You no longer seek compatibility. You require resonance, and those who can't match your frequency won't survive in your atmosphere. That's not cruelty, that's energetic governance, because every law repels what violates it, not through resistance, but through dissonance. You don't have to fight, you just have to remain intact, unbent, unfolded, uncompromised, and soon the environment shifts. The conversations shift, the invitations shift, not because you said anything, but because you enforce the code. Reality begins to tilt, not in your favor, but in your design. Because a sovereign mind doesn't just exist inside four walls. It casts shadow, it bends light, it alters dynamics. And here's the truth most people will never admit. The world has always belonged to those who obeyed their own law, louder than others enforced theirs. This is what you've built, a law so deeply embedded in your movement that even silence feels like structure, a law so self-contained that it makes external systems feel disorganized. Now ask yourself, if the world must obey your law to access your presence, what kind of world do you want to build around you? Because reality doesn't respond to what you want. It responds to what you're willing to enforce. And what comes next is not about clarity. It's about consequence. Designing your law is not enough. You must enforce it. Without applause, without permission, without noise. Because the moment you hesitate, you send a signal that your law is optional. And the world is always listening for your hesitation. They'll test your silence, push your boundaries, mock your clarity. Not because they hate it, but because they need to know if it's real. So make it real. Every decision you make from this point forward must answer to your internal court. Not your guilt, not your fear, not the old versions of you begging to stay relevant. They don't get a vote. You are the author, the enforcer, the jurisdiction. And that means you say no without needing a reason. You leave rooms that no longer match your mental law. You detach from people who don't respect the code, no matter their history. You withhold access, not out of punishment, but out of precision. Because the more you enforce, the more the world conforms. Not to you, but to the law you've chosen to live by. And here's the last truth. If you don't enforce it, you'll be enslaved by those who do. Someone's law is always winning. If it's not yours, It's theirs. So today, start with this. 24 hours of total mental enforcement. No reactivity, no justification, no unfiltered access. Audit every thought, every decision, every boundary. Ask only one question. Does this honor the law I've written? If not, let it die at the gate. Let the silence speak for you. Let your distance define your frame. Let your clarity cause discomfort. And when they ask what changed, say nothing. They'll feel it. Because a king doesn't explain the law. He is the law.